This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you. Okay, so we're going to check out this video by Professor Steve Keen, I believe his name is. So this is a really popular and highly respected and highly regarded economist. So he is a guy that basically years before the financial crash, based on his understanding of the economy, his mathematical models, and basically his level of critical thinking. So again, you know, he's famously someone that views himself as somewhat of a renegade economist, where he goes against the mainstream, and he's similar to someone like Gary's economic, Gary Stevenson, who again views himself as going against the grain in that regard, and based on this critical thinking, moving away from conventional thinking, and his deep understanding of the economy and economic models, it allowed him to, as I say, predict the financial crisis well in advance of what was happening. And many other people were able to, well, I say many other people, there were other economists that were able to identify this issue. As I say, Gary Stevenson was somebody who understood certain aspects of the economy in terms of making a big bet around what would happen if there's a massive transfer of wealth with respect to the pandemic. And also, obviously, those that were involved in the film with respect to The Big Short. So again, I can't remember the exact names of the individuals involved. But obviously, you know, if you watch the film The Big Short, those are two examples of individuals that, you know, that understood the implications of, you know, collateral debt obligations. And this was the fundamental financial instrument, which was basically being rated as AAA, which basically means there's little risk involved with these instruments, and they were mortgage-backed instruments. But actually, they were being bundled up with basically financial agreements that were being underwritten by individuals or debt to individuals that were basically unable to pay them. And that is where basically everything crashed and collapsed, and the rest is history, so to speak. So although he wasn't the only person, he was probably the only person outside of, you know, some of the traders I mentioned in The Big Short that said so openly, publicly, and with his chest, so to speak. So he has massive levels of credentials. He's somebody I follow. I, you know, really respect what he has to say. And I would recommend subscribing to his channel, as I have done so, to get a deeper understanding of his, you know, economic philosophy, his knowledge, and obviously hearing it from the source is always better than hearing it secondhand from someone like myself, for example, because as I say, my own feeling is it's always better to form your own opinions about everything. But as I say, the purpose of this channel, I suppose, and the purpose of this video is to give my own thoughts around what he is saying, and his thoughts around where we're going now that we have Trump in government, and in terms of what's happening geopolitically with respect to the US and their foreign policy. So yeah, I wanted to check out this video for those reasons. So yeah, let's see what we can learn and take it from there.
Trump is stupid enough to take on what Israel wanted to do, which was destroy Iran.
Now, straight off the bat, we don't really know what Donald Trump wants to do here. Now, there is this massive conspiracy theory that Israel and Epstein have a lot of intel on Trump, based on his time as a private citizen before he became president, in the Epstein file. And that's why it's been heavily redacted. And it's only recently been ordered and that it's been fully released by Congress. So although Trump is presenting it as though they have been behind it, it's actually Congress that has forced his hand. And what we will also recall at the time of recording, you know, I think it was about last week or so. So at the time of recording, this is April 2026. Melania Trump actually came out to basically create that political and social pressure for more people to be investigated, because what she said was that there was more people involved. And she must have known this would implicate her husband as well.
who she didn't refer to in this announcement as her husband. She referred to him as Donald Trump. So it's quite clear that she's trying to distinguish herself morally and ethically from the situation. And my own feeling around this is that the timing was essentially around promoting her book, because she could have said this at any time. But ultimately, that is the running theory, that Israel have something on Donald Trump, and therefore he is having to do this. But my own feeling is slightly different. And as I say, I would view this as speculation. And when we think about the wider things the US has done prior to that invasion in Iran, one has to consider, is Donald Trump really acting under some sort of coercion, or is he actually just doing what he and the US wants to do? And what I'm referring to is this pressure that was placed on Europe to stop, move away from getting their oil from Russia as a result of the Ukraine war, and agreeing to basically get their oil from the US, which Donald Trump has threatened to restrict based on the fact that many of what would be his normal European allies have not jumped straight in and joined in the Iranian bombing. There was, essentially what I would call a military coup to basically oust the Venezuelan leader, who was not a great leader ethically. He was a very brutal leader, but nonetheless, he was also sitting on a massive stockpile of oil, which now the Americans have secured. And all of these actions are now basically meaning that many of these other countries, many of their economic rivals, such as China, such as Europe, and Australia, are now having to go into their reserves because the Strait of Hormuz has been blocked by Iran, which Iran always threatened they were going to do. So everybody understood, or certainly the US would have understood, by attacking Iran and based on Iran's threats, there'll be a massive squeeze on oil supplies. And they've just coincidentally done a number of things that secure their own US domestic supplies. And there is a great video on this, actually. It's called Pirate America, I think, and I'll leave a link in the comment, to that video. And I suggest you check that one out as well. But as I say, I think this is just more complicated than it first seems. And I don't think the explanation can be Donald Trump is foolishly doing something, or Donald Trump is doing stuff simply at the behest of Israel.
Financial Times is reporting that traders placed $580 million worth of oil bets.
Just 15 minutes later, President Trump posted on Truth Social that he was halting planned strikes on Iranian power plants.
If someone is using this as a way of making profit, then it's playing a game with the lives of people on this planet. Trump is being pressured by Netanyahu, who always wanted.
And again, I do want to repeat this point here. So this idea that Trump is being pressured by Netanyahu, if I've got his name pronounced that correctly, apologies if I butchered the name here, is a theory. We don't have any way of substantiating that. And it's a reasonable theory, right? I'm not dismissing it. Any other theory is not stronger or weaker. All I'm stating here is that we simply don't know. And I think it is important to reinforce that point, because what I'm not personally liking is that it kind of gives a way of many of those that have supported Donald Trump to fail to fully accept accountability for what Donald Trump is doing, right? If we keep saying, well, Donald Trump is basically being forced to do this, it kind of gives him an out somewhat. And in a way it doesn't, because he shouldn't have been caught in a compromised position, and that's a separate matter entirely. But it makes the situation slightly softer. It kind of invokes an element of sympathy, maybe. And I think for me, until we know more about the situation, I'm not going to give Donald Trump this grace, right? He is the most powerful man in the world, and if there's no other living beings in the universe, that extends equally. He is the most powerful man in the universe. This is the context we need to see this through. And Israel relies heavily on US backing. So as I say, we can't simply just view this, in my opinion, as Israel placing a huge amount of pressure on Donald Trump. There's more to this than meets the eye, for sure. And in terms of the trading, again, this ties back to this other theory that this is part of potentially a wider calculated move, whereby it was always understood that oil prices would be affected in the way they were affected, what wouldn't have been known as the timing. And that's where the insider trader comes in. It's like, okay, it's very difficult to time the market, but if you have insider knowledge around certain announcements, then you can time the most effective time to place trades, essentially. And that is essentially what Professor Steve Keen is alluding to here with respect to this opportunism that's taken place. But as I say, there's one theory that says this is like coincidental, circumstantial, they're not really connected, i.e. the trading and the timing of the trade and this war. But there's another case to be made that actually much of this stuff is interconnected. And that's also ultimately something I don't think we should be ruling out either at this stage.
To have an attack on Iran. He underestimated the capacity of Iran to fight back.
Yeah, and again, that's another point I want to make. Did he underestimate Iran's capacity to fight back if they only are doing arguably what they said they were always going to do? Right. So for me, this is the context that's important. One train of thought would say, yes, he did underestimate it. If his only goal was to somehow overthrow the government for whatever reason, or access the oil, right? Or do some sort of deal, right? I don't really actually know why America actually started this war. Like, we don't really know the true reason, right? One reason is democracy. One reason is weapon of mass destructions. One reason is we want to secure oil reserves. Another reason is actually it's all a part of Israel's strategy of basically having oil pass through their country, and they become the central power with respect to 40% of the world's oil supply. Another theory is what I've mentioned as well around actually, undermining China's industrial development and their economy. Like, we really don't know actually why this is actually happening. So in that context, it's very difficult to get to a situation or get to an assertion that Trump has underestimated Iran. Maybe he always knew, as I say, Iran were going to behave in the way they said they were going to behave, and they've already taken, responsive action or proactive action around this by securing an oil supply from Venezuela, for example.
Praying that there'd be some way to back out of this war. Nobody can talk about anything other than what's happening in Iran, and of course what's happening to the oil price and the availability of oil and all the other resources coming out of the Strait of Hormuz that are now being blocked by this conflict. But there's something happening on stock markets and commodity markets as well that's worth discussing. And Ed Conway, who does the empirical research for Sky News, has found something rather fascinating. So let's have a look at it and see what Ed has found, and then let's see what could possibly explain these strange dynamics on the stock market.
It was a really massive moment when Donald Trump came out, did the social media post basically saying that talks were underway. You'll probably remember at that point, markets went crazy. A lot of people selling off oil, buying shares because they saw a big opportunity.
Yeah, and it's interesting that sentiment can create so much volatility, because ultimately that's what it would have been. A simple announcement on Donald Trump's, and again, that has to also be considered as well in terms of that. That's a bit strange that, again, it's on Donald Trump's social platform rather than the government's platform. So again, even if you consider this to be not insider trading, there's an element of, well, unless you're on Truth Social, you don't get access to this information at the earliest opportunity. And one has to consider that as well. So there is a conflict there, actually, where the US president is allowed to make these statements on his own personal platform, which then incentivizes those that are following what he wants, what he's saying, in order to take advantage of any trading opportunity to also have to subscribe to his platform, right? So it's just another example of how, arguably, in my opinion, Donald Trump is using his office to basically enhance the value proposition of his own personal platform and position traders in the know or close to him to benefit from announcements he's making that have an impact on the market, which is sensitive to sentiment.
Opportunity to make money out of this. And here's what's striking. What we're looking at here is just the volumes, how many people were doing the buying and selling at any given time. If you look at when Donald Trump made that post, it was 11:05 UK time, there was a massive flurry of activity immediately afterwards. Not surprising at all. But here's what is surprising. 15 minutes before he made that post, a group of people made a massive trade. One of the biggest.
Yeah, and I think for me, this is interesting. It's the size of the trade that was very, very unusual. And also there's a lot that we don't actually know, right? This is only what we've measured. So what you have to consider is that there's a lot of apps that allow you simply to gamble, right? You can basically bet on anything. So someone could have bet that this announcement was going to be made. Somebody could have bet that, again, the price of oil would come down as a result. You know, there's all sorts of things you can do to take advantage of this. So again, the size of money that transferred as a result of this announcement to some degree won't be fully understood and won't be fully known. So again, it's highly suspicious, actually, what we're seeing here. It's very difficult to ignore. And it's almost a situation where it's like the people involved are like, you know what, we just don't care.
Trades that we'd seen in that market up until that announcement. Did they actually know what the president was about to announce?
Probably yes.
Because when you take that trade on this market and the other oil markets, they have made hundreds of millions of dollars potentially.
That's the scary thing, because what's being implied there is that this is insider trading in some sense. Someone has information about what's going to happen. Trump is going to make an announcement, and 15 minutes before he is going to make that announcement, somebody makes a large trade which will benefit out of the impact of that announcement on the market. It is.
Yeah, and I think there's something else, you know, if I play devil's advocate, there's something else we do need to consider here about insider trading. Now, this is clearly, in my opinion, insider trading, right? I don't have proof, but I think from my perspective, I'm confident enough to make that statement. Now, what we can't be confident about, in my opinion, is who is the leak. So what I mean by this is that Donald Trump, if he's going to make a statement on his platform, chances are he has individuals that work for him. Chances are it might be somebody else writing these statements, right? You know, we kind of assume, based on the language that's used in these posts that Donald Trump makes, is that it's him making them. And that could be the case. But it wouldn't be surprising, actually, if there are members of staff who also are involved in making these posts, whether they're on his platform or elsewhere, vetting the posts to make sure that, again, they don't harm his well, he's not going to be re-elected unless something strange happens and something unconstitutional happens. But obviously there's going to be an element of filtering before things go out. Now, in that scenario, it's not unfeasible that somebody else leaked this information. Somebody else was like, oh, I know Donald Trump is going to make this announcement. Let me tell my people. The reason why that is probably not likely to be the case, though, is because of the size of the bets that were made. These were not retail bets. It's the kind of money where it's institutional level, right? It's a huge amount of money and huge bets, essentially, that were placed to make these gains. So that is why it feels more conspiratorial and less like the scenario I'm describing, where there's an opportunistic moment to say, oh, okay, I know something ahead of time. Let me quickly tell my guys, and let's make some cash.
Unthinkable given the scale of damage to the global economy, the number of people who could suffer because of this change in going forward in this year. We face potential famines in countries like India, even famines in countries like Australia, because suddenly they're going to run out of oil to be able to transport food around. If someone is using this as a way of making profit, then it's playing a game with the lives of people on this planet in a way which is beyond reprehensible.
Yeah, and again, I am repeating myself here. So it's not that I disagree with what's being said here. What I'm questioning in my own mind is the framing, right? It makes it sound as though it was opportunistic, right? This idea that, let's make this announcement because there's a war going on and let's make some money if there's some insider trading. But as I say, in the grand schemes of things, a lot of other things have happened that make it feel like that this is not just about people taking advantage of a moment in time, and actually there's a wider strategy to destabilize competing economies, competing industries, essentially. And what I mean by that is destabilizing China and creating a increased demand for American oil, for American dollars, right? That is another theory. So in that context, all of what we're seeing, and this situation where you have a family and a president that is using the office continually, they've always been doing this to make money through their crypto projects, through the merchandising, through their investments. So I think one of Donald Trump's sons, for example, has invested in a drone company. Again, why would he do that? And maybe in America, knowing it's a hawkish government, investing in military companies might be an idea, right? But again, it's like when you connect all these different dots, a picture starts forming where actually it starts looking and appearing more calculated. It starts looking like it's part of a grander scheme rather than just independent actors doing things. Now, the truth is, it's probably a mixture of those two things, but I do want to raise this point around how what Professor Steve Keen is saying is being framed, and why, in my own mind, there's still question marks around the framing he's presenting.
Don't know that it's actually happened. It could be luck, as Ed is saying there. But the possibility is that someone thinks this is a way to make a fortune by gaming the market, knowing the president is going to make an announcement which is going to move the market dramatically 15 minutes after you make a position. You saw the difference in the oil price there. That was from $100 to 85. It's a $15 drop. If you can sell at 100 before it drops for 15 and make other positions to options trading as well to benefit from that change, you make a fortune. Is someone making money out of this war? Is this war not just an ideological battle, not even about security? Is it about gaming the market and making a...
But yeah, and I do agree with a lot of this, but what I would also say is what makes this behavior. So if we just look at this behavior in isolation, this trading behavior, this idea of using war to make money, to capture resources, destabilize governments, decapitate heads of state, which is what we saw in Venezuela, to simply access resources. Is this unusual? Is this something America has never done before, or any other country has never done before? Much of what we're seeing and observing, unfortunately, is par for the course, I suspect, with geopolitics, unfortunately. The question is, has a president been so overt about what they're doing with respect to the trading, for example, and the size of the trades, and been so explicit about their motivations? We want the oil, we want Greenland. Like, there's just no sense of diplomacy. That's what seems to be different here. And the reason why I say it feels different is because there was no attempt to hide these trades, to be honest with you. Like, the people involved would have known that those trades would have been highly visible. And the timing is very, very questionable. So the timing and the size makes it really, really visible. And I think for me, that is what's new around what is happening, actually, rather than this idea that, people are making money from this situation is somehow in itself new. For me, it's just how overt and how explicit it is that makes it feel different from what would normally happen during wartime.
Fortune. And that is horrific that you can even consider that this is what's going on. Again, this is the sort of behaviour that comes out of people who don't really care about other people in any sense whatsoever. They're simply trying to profit out of the situation. This just looks like people treating a monumental shock to the global economy as a way of making a profit. One thing.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that is what always happens, right? It's not just now. So basically, Donald Trump is not, you know, responsible for that mindset. You know, any sitting president, any sitting prime minister, that is what's going to be happening when there's a war. You know, if you have, you know, oil commodities, then you're also benefiting in some ways. If you know, if those holdings go up in value, you're also benefiting from this situation, right? So you're not necessarily the cause of it, but you are benefiting from it. And I think traders may have this same mindset as well, where it's like, well, I'm not in control of the situation. I will simply assess the situation and make a trading decision on that basis. So trading, in my mind, is very it doesn't it's very objective. It's quite cold in this respect. It's not about ethics per se. There will be ethical traders, but that's not essentially, in my mind, how many traders are going to see any situation, actually. Essentially, you have a view around what may happen in the future based on current circumstances. Somebody else has a counter view. You essentially make a bet against each other using trading instruments, and one of you wins, one of you loses, you know, and we move on to the next trade, right? So I think for me, this again, I do agree with how he feels about it. I feel the same way, but I don't see this as being unique to the Donald Trump administration, is basically what I'm saying here.
Which this also makes me think about is Trump trying to understand Trump's behaviour. As I've said before, I think a lot of it comes out of sheer narcissism. He's also.
Yeah, and I agree that I would view Donald Trump as narcissistic, but both myself and Professor Steve Keen are speculating on that. We don't know, right? We don't know Donald Trump. It's just our opinion of who he is based on his actions, his interactions, how he talks about his family, how he talks about himself, and how he positions himself and people like himself relative to other people that he sees beneath him. So I would agree equally that Donald Trump is a narcissist. You know, there's an element of confirmation bias when I hear that from Professor Steve Keen. But objectively speaking, neither of us really know who Donald Trump is.
One of the explanations for the war, which makes eminent sense, Trump was being pressured by Netanyahu, who always wanted to have an attack on Iran, and for whatever reason, the political relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, Trump has done it, whereas all the other.
Yeah, so many things can be true at once. So I would agree with the thesis that Netanyahu has always wanted to invade Iran, because he's always argued there's weapons of mass destruction, or they're very close to weapons of mass destruction. And no president previously has entertained this. Now, again, what their motivations would be and how they view things, you know, from a geopolitical position is not going to be the same as Donald Trump. So again, it might just be a perfect storm in terms of actually Donald Trump's objectives and Israel's objectives just happen to align more. So it does make sense now for, you know, from a US perspective to invade Iran, knowing the outcome of what that will be in terms of oil supply, and then how they can leverage that position to economically punish those that do not fall in line with the US agenda. Now, again, you have to think about this in the context of why he introduced tariffs. Why did Donald Trump introduce tariffs? And what he said was that basically it was because, you know, he did not like the trading terms that the US was having with other nations, where basically the US was the consumer. He doesn't like that. Now, what we're seeing now is changing things with respect to oil, where now the US is becoming the place where, you know, is the only place really you can reliably obtain crude or heavy oil, and all other oil supplies are being disrupted by this conflict. So again, that's all very circumstantial. It's very coincidental. It doesn't prove that there's this wider strategy of America trying to, or Israel trying to control oil supplies. But it's another theory in my mind that hangs together, essentially, as well as what is being positioned here, which is basically Israel has managed to, coerce this particular president to do what they want. I think there's an element of truth in both scenarios whereby Israel wants this to happen, but I think my other feeling is that actually Donald Trump also wants this to happen, irrespective of what we think is going on in the Epstein files.
Other American leaders before Trump did not want to go into Iran. We know that the Pentagon wanted to invade Iran, but they think also the research the Pentagon did said it's a really bad idea. We might want to be one of the countries we knock over. We knocked over Iraq, we knocked over Afghanistan, etc., etc. The Pentagon had that intention.
Yeah, and I think that does give credence to what Professor Steve Keen is saying. If Donald Trump said he did not want to do it before, that would suggest something has forced his hand, right? To be fair. But I think for me, people are complex and people can change their minds. And, before he's president and after he's president and when he becomes president, things can change as you know more when you see opportunities, essentially. And also one has to consider what is the Pentagon's objectives? Are they the same? Are they commercial, right? So Donald Trump, if we view him as a narcissist, we'll look at this in a way of, okay, what can I and my family get from this situation? Whilst the Pentagon is thinking more around, okay, is this good for our country? Will we lose American lives if we do this? Will we actually achieve the aims that we want to achieve? Are there actually weapons of mass destruction? Right, that's the lens they're looking at it through. So whatever the Pentagon is doing, it doesn't necessarily have to align with what the sitting president is trying to achieve. Especially if we view this president as a narcissistic, self-serving president that is only in office from his perspective to essentially empower and enrich himself.
But they would have potentially done the research and to say, what capabilities does Iran have to fight back, and say no. Now, this time it's gone ahead, America, in particular Donald Trump, and Pete Hegseth, whom I prefer to call Pete Hogsbreath, by the way.
Yeah, and again, this is another area where I do agree with the professor. This guy, again, it's all very sentimental, and there's no, it's just an opinion I have. But he is truly a cartoon character of an individual. He says the most outlandish and crazy things, and it's very hard to take him and much of the Trump administration seriously.
So-called Secretary of War, maybe they just massively underestimated the capacity of Iran to fight back. And so that's...
And again, I'm going to repeat myself. I'm not sure Israel or America have underestimated anything, if I'm being honest with you.
That's the explanation, and they got themselves into this terrible trap, and now they've got to find a way to extricate themselves. But if it's also being used as a way of making a fortune by pumping and dumping on the market, then it's even harder to reverse the war, because Americans who don't want to see a war happen, we're thinking, oh, we've got to find a way to extricate ourselves from this. But if it's being used as a game to increase the profit, increase the money of people who Trump knows or who know Trump or whatever else you can imply here, it's horrific. And it means that no matter what we say, this war's going to continue because people are making money out of it. Oh, that's...
Yeah, and I think for me that I do kind of accept that idea that this whole thing, however you view it, is around enriching those who are very wealthy and connected to Donald Trump already. But I think we need to consider this through two lenses. One is financial gain in terms of realized cash, because as I say, if you make a trade, initially you're going to realize that in dollars. But then what do you do with those dollars? You buy assets. And if, for example, you destabilize Venezuela for reasons of democracy, and two things can be true at once, right? Maybe it was for reasons of democracy, right? Maybe it has improved democracy, but the price of that democracy is your nation's resources, all of them, i.e. the oil. So one has to look at it that way. Not only have they got access to this cash through, well-timed trades, let's say, but they also have access to the only reliable resource of oil. And they're restricting others' access to their own oil supplies and forcing them to eat into their oil reserves. So there's a lot of assets basically moving into the hands of private companies, private US companies, the US government, Donald Trump, right? And access to resources that other people may have or supplies they may have are being disrupted through the conflict. So that's another way of thinking about this whole scenario as well. Actually, what is happening with asset distribution, global asset distribution, and oil is an asset. It's a natural resource. What is happening to all of that? What is happening to the control over that? And the control that many people did have, how is that being interfered with? Right? Because assets are only assets if you can control them. And if someone denies you your control, it denies you the ability to realize any future cash flows from said asset. So that's another lens, I think, in which to consider what we're observing here.
Not just in terms of being able to sell Texas oil for more than they could before the supply of oil from Saudi Arabia was cut off, but actually gaming the market in a pump and dump scheme. One thing
Yeah, and I think, Professor Steve Keen, is touching on what I've just said, actually, and he understands that. He's not gone into it into detail, and he could probably give you a much better explanation than I just tried to give you just now. But I think he also understands this from the asset perspective, essentially, which is why he's talking about this disruption to, Iranians' oil supply, to typically would be China. That's one of their major exporters, and the fact that the US is now the place where you can reliably get oil based on the fact they've captured Venezuela's oil reserves.
Which makes me think this is what's actually happening, is one of the crazy things you've seen come out of Trump. You would have probably noticed him when he said that he's got a very nice gift from Iran and was toying around with it as, I got a present from Iran. The president was letting 8 ships get through the Straits of Hormuz. Now, those 8 ships weren't American ships. They were ships which were with the countries which had agreed to buy the oil using the Chinese currency, not the American dollar. And the oil was going to countries which are not allied with America, certainly not involved in the potential invasion of Iran. So it wasn't a gift given directly to Trump. So in what sense could it be a gift? Well, one way it could be a gift is that because there's 8 tankerfuls of oil end up in the market, that's going to depress the oil price to some extent, which could potentially accentuate the gain if you do something else which is going to panic people and make people worried about the oil being not available again. It means that this, what looks like a crazy comment, he present to Trump, he didn't receive the oil directly. It wasn't sent to America even, it was sent to other countries. It makes no sense to say he got a gift. But if this falls into something which can be exploited in a pump and dump scheme, then that's where the gift comes into Trump.
Yeah, and essentially what he's referring to is market manipulation, essentially, where Trump is giving misinformation or misleading information in order to create volatility because of this sentiment element of the market. The market reacts to sentiment, and certainly from statements from, the leader of the free world. It can be viewed as essentially market manipulation. And if you know the timing of these announcements and what those announcements are going to be, which is basically what Professor Steve Keen is referring to here, then it allows for insider trading. And it's hard to disagree with this theory, essentially. I guess, as I say, what we just have to keep in the back of our mind is the context on the framing of what is happening, not necessarily the facts.
And that is even scarier. I've been praying that there'd be some way to back out of this war. But if this war is being used as a way of profiting, whether it's Trump or whether it's associates of Trump or heaven knows what, the war's not going to stop while people who are profiting from it on the markets on a 15-minute interval between when Trump makes an announcement and before the rest of the world finds out. It means this war is unstoppable. The damage it's doing is just going to continue. This is a war that should never have happened. There was no justification for attacking Iran at this time, took out the nuclear power. All the normal interpretation would say he wants a way to back out. But if this is being used to make a profit, then he doesn't want to back out. He wants to continue seeing them.
You know, I think that's a fair point around this conflict between personal incentives and what is best actually for most people in the US, right? You know, this was a president that platformed himself on no more wars because there was an understanding that a lot of spending on proxy wars or direct conflict takes away economically from, you know, domestic infrastructure, from domestic spend, from support that was needed in the US, right? It just puts a drain on your national resources. So, but if you're finding yourself in a situation where, because there is a war and because there is this instability and because there is this volatility in the markets, you yourself as the president or as people closely associated with you and your family members can continue to become increasingly wealthy. And suddenly we all forget about the Epstein files. Like, that's just until Melania Trump spoke, like, we were not even interested. Well, there's only so much outrage to go around. You know, you do just get emotionally exhausted, unfortunately. And this is really tough to say because obviously, you know, the Epstein victims should never be forgotten, right? But this war was so big that what was happening in Iran was so, you know, bad, essentially, that that was absorbing the minds of many people. And there wasn't room to even be thinking about getting back to putting pressure on the Epstein files. Now, you know, what we're seeing now is, you know, a situation where if this war continues and had Melania Trump had not said anything, then we're not getting that pressure to release more of the Epstein files. We're not necessarily in a situation where, you know, anything's going to change fundamentally. We forget about all the other problems that are going on. And the president is in a position where he can continue to make statements that enable trades to be timed to perfection, right? So that conflict that Professor Steve Keen is outlining, I think is very valid. And I do agree with him that it's something we do need to pay close attention to. It's very, very problematic, to say the least.
Market going up and down, accentuate the ups and downs and make as much money as possible. Not saying it's Trump that's doing that, but it's the associates, potentially, people who get to know what he's going to do.
Yeah, and this essentially was what I was saying before. We can't necessarily accuse Trump himself of doing this. He will definitely have, you know, an element of reasonable deniability, right? We don't know conclusively that Trump is the leak. But I do agree with Professor Steve Keen that it's probably his associates. But again, it could all be calculated, right? It could be set up in such a way to give Donald Trump reasonable deniability. So he's still colluding in a sense. He's just being positioned in a way that protects him. And that is not uncommon for any national leader, right? Where things happen and decisions are made, but they are given deliberately this segregation that allows them to have reasonable deniability. And you have to think about things like espionage, for example, and illegal actions that nations may take for the greater good. But obviously it can't come back to the leader of that country.
One point which we speculation about is what's going to be the impact on the global economy of shutting off this oil. Mainstream economists would argue that it wouldn't have much impact at all because the way that they analyse production is they argue that you have these inputs of labour and capital and energy, and you can substitute. If you don't have energy, you can substitute more labour and more capital. So that type of argument comes out of the way that conventional economists model production. That's called a Cobb-Douglas production function. It's the dominant model used by mainstream economists. And a group of German economists, back when the Ukraine war began, did an estimate using neoclassical theory of saying what would be the impact if the energy supply to Germany fell by 10%, because that was speculation about the impact of losing access to Russian oil. That much energy would drop. Well, they fed that into this Cobb-Douglas production function, and the answer was that a 10% fall in the level of energy into the German economy would reduce German GDP by 0.4%. In other words, 10% fall in energy, trivial fall in GDP. Now, why do they get that answer? It's because their what's called a production function that they use in their models, says that the impact of a change in one of the inputs would be technology, labour, capital, and then energy. The impact depends upon the fraction that labour and capital and technology make up of total GDP. So labour, according to the Cobb-Douglas production function, contributes 70% of output, capital contributes 26% of output, and 4% comes out of the energy industries. So therefore a 10% fall in energy only causes 0.4% fall in GDP. I'm taking a look at energy and GDP together. This is gross world product, which is the sum of the GDP of all the economies on the planet, the black line up here. And then the red line is gross world product measured in the American dollars in 2015. And you can see that they're pretty much parallel with each other. Now that gives you an extremely high correlation, but partly that correlation comes out of the fact that they're both rising. So the next chart down the bottom takes a look at the change in energy and the change in gross world product in percentage terms, and then graphs them against each other. And this is from, just to zoom in, this is from 1972 through to 2024. So it's the last 50 years of economic data. And not only do they move the same way, the moves are the same scale. So if you have a 6% increase in energy, you have a 6% increase in GDP, almost precisely the same. If you have a huge fall as we had back under COVID, when it fell by about 8%, you had an 8% fall in GDP. So what it says is that the change in gross world product is virtually identical to the change in energy. And that means that if we have a 10% fall in energy, we're going to have a 10% fall in GDP, not a 0.4%, but a 10% fall in GDP. And this is empirically based. There's no theory involved in this. This is just the empirical data. The empirical data tells you something that says the impact of a loss of energy is 25 times larger than the neoclassical economists will think it is. That's how wrong they are.
Yeah, so we said a lot there, and I think it was very, very instructive. And I think for me, there's a lot we can learn, actually. So firstly, it comes back to this point around critical thinking, where again, he's outlining this conventional way of thinking about the economy that economists are taught. And this is something Gary Stevenson, as I said, has talked about, where he mentioned the fact that they don't model for wealth distribution, for example. And what he's saying here essentially is that the conventional methods are not essentially correctly modeling the impact of energy. Now, my own feeling around this is that although the theory might be flawed, we also have to assume these economists are probably able to consider other theories and come up with their own ideas, but use and rely on these theories and not basically see the wood for the trees. Because that's essentially the danger with simply relying on economic models like this and not really understanding them, essentially. And I think, he's in that world. And I do accept what he's saying, that many economists and maybe inexperienced economists may make this a mistake and not see the limitations of the models they're using. But my own feeling as well is that labor capital implicitly requires energy. And I think that in itself is where there may be a conflation from a modeling perspective, and why it's not explicitly modeled in the model he referred to. I can't remember the name of the model, the economic model that he was referring to. And I think as well, what we also have to consider actually is that if conceivably America understood this implicitly, i.e., if they are deliberately restricting oil supplies under this other theory I've presented, that therefore undermines China's ability to grow in terms of GDP, in terms of production, is it feasible that their economists understood this relationship and this fundamental relationship to the economy with respect to energy and industrialization, right? I think most people implicitly can understand that. That might be sort of unlearned through training in this unconventional, this conventional economic model. But I think for me, it is understood, just through observation, just anecdotally, when you see wars, the first thing they attacked is infrastructure, energy production, hospitals, schools. So we know how damaging it is to the economies of countries if you attack those areas. So I think from my perspective, although what he's saying is fundamentally correct, I think it is important to also understand that I think, again, there is the possibility that there are many economists that do understand this relationship implicitly, even if they weren't taught this, and or the US are taking advantage of what he's shown us in his own model.
And I think this is one reason that I'm such a critic of mainstream economics, because it's divorced from the physical world in which we live.
And I do agree with that point, right? It's very important to trust your own real world lived experience, right? So again, when you see this departure between what you're seeing in, models like this we're seeing here with what you are reasonably observing, we should always critically challenge what we're understanding. So the first question will be, do you actually understand the model and its limitations? Yes or no? And or if there's still an issue, okay, is your experience biased? So that's probably the two explanations, right? Either your experience is not representative of the general experience, it's very siloed and singular, or the model is limited, or it's a mixture of both. And what critical thinking allows us to do is continually reconcile those two positions to come to our own truth. And that is what Professor Steve Keen is showing us here in this image. It's his own reconciliation of what he's observing, what he's experienced, his understanding of the models, the understanding of the limitations, that then allows him to more reliably predict what may happen more reliably. So I think for me, that is what we can take from someone like Professor Steve Keen. He is a master of his industry in this regard. And I think it's because he's combining those two things. And I think his criticism of maybe people like myself, who are less experienced, and other economists, let's say, is that they're not doing this. And I think for me, that is what I'm taking personally from what Professor Steve Keen is saying here. Understand the limits of the models you're relying on, and constantly question and refine that understanding.
It's ludicrous to say that a 10% fall in energy, or a 10% increase for that matter, would only change GDP by 0.4% either way. That's completely trivializing the role of energy in production. When you take it seriously by looking at the data, you see that the 10% fall in energy, 10% fall in GDP. Now, most people, I think, would have some gut feeling that that relationship would hold, but people who've swallowed conventional economics trivialize the impact of losing access to critical inputs like oil.
Yeah, and I think, again, it just repeats the point, right? Most people would have an instinctive feel that they are linked. I think that's fair to say, actually. And as I say, it's almost as though, as he's alluding to here, they've unlearned it through academia, and that's the irony of what's going on. And then he's had to then re-engineer it through academia to get it through peer reviews potentially, right? So it's like what we always knew. We have to empirically get back there, and there's nothing wrong with it actually, because what we feel in our gut isn't necessarily the truth. It does warrant scrutiny, actually. So it's not that what he's doing here is not constructive and is not valuable. We do need to empirically prove that our guts can be relied upon, so to speak. But it's just an interesting observation that, you kind of just unlearn common sense, essentially, which I think is what he's calling out here. And I do agree with him.
And again, one of the crazy things about conventional economic theory is that it has absolutely no link to the physical world, to the natural world. So the model of production that the neoclassicals use basically says you can produce output by combining technology and labor and capital, no inputs from the real world. Now that's nonsense. If you have no inputs from the real world, you can produce absolutely nothing. And my little shorthand saying on that front relates to energy, and it is that labor without energy is a corpse. Capital without energy is a sculpture. Without energy, you can do nothing. Because economists have this naive model that doesn't involve any inputs from the natural world at all, let alone energy, it's made us all complacent about the impact of losing something like access to oil in the Persian Gulf. Also, economic theory in general blinds you to the importance of understanding the production system. If you go back 40 years in economics, you actually find their models were better on this front, not worse. So 40 years ago, or 50 years ago, conventional neoclassical economists used what they call computable general equilibrium models. Now, what those models...
And I think that's a good point here. And it was something I was thinking about when, as he was talking through this, in terms of this instinctive feel. And the word that caught my attention there was equilibrium, right? So if you understand thermodynamics, I mean, you don't have to have a deep understanding. I don't understand thermodynamics, right? But it's this law of conservation, right? What you get in is what you get out. And as an accountant, I kind of lean this way as well in terms of like the double entry method, the book, that's how we think about bookkeeping. What you put in kind of needs to be, you need to see an equal and opposite some other way in the financial statements. So you can't create energy and you can't destroy energy, right? And this is why, as I say, instinctively, we understand that if, production requires capital and labor and technology, all of those things are driven by energy. And AI is another example of things that, all this AI slop needs lots and lots of energy. And that's the problem, ChatGPT, OpenAI is running into now, right? Everything is just taking so much energy. So again, I think for me, this is another thing to consider. And this is why I kind of view resources almost as a zero-sum game, right? It's not the way the economy is modeled, but it's ultimately how I see the economic playing field, whereby if someone wins, somebody else is losing, right? And value is being transferred rather than being created. And assets are being transferred and wealth is being transferred rather than being created, and resources are being moved around. Because ultimately, what assets are or underwritten by is real world resources, right? Energy. And where does energy come from? Resources, commodities, and they are limited. So that is why renewable energy is something we should be more seriously thinking about. But whilst we continually rely on limited resources, the limitation of those resources will limit economic growth implicitly.
did was describe the production system for the economy as an input-output system. Let's say there's 100 different major classifications of commodities. Then each line is like a recipe saying how many elements of this, that, and the other do you need to make iron, for example, and how many of those do you need to make plastics, and how many of those do you need to make cars, and so on and so forth. So with those tables, they could actually say, well, if we see there's going to be a 10% fall in oil, then looking at the input-output dynamics, this means there's going to be a 10% fall in GDP.
Yeah, so this input-output dynamic is kind of how accountants, or I can't talk for all accountants, but it's kind of how I see things as well as an accountant. And again, there's limitations with that. So to be clear, there is no perfect model of anything. You have to understand the limitations. But basically what I'm saying is that when there's an in, there's an out. There's an equal and opposite, zero sum, essentially, right? Everything is balanced, equilibrium. That's the words he used with respect to this older economic model he's describing. And in the case of thermodynamics and organic chemistry, for example, the balancing figure will be heat, low value or low or residual heat, right? So the energy system is always in balance. And essentially, this mechanism forces you, to consider things like, if something diminishes over here, i.e., if you have a lack of supply of energy, we must account for it somewhere else with respect to GDP. And that is the strength of that particular model, right? And I think that is why he's referring to it, because that model, plus the newer model he's describing, a deep understanding of both those models will make you a better economist, essentially. And he understands both of them and can see the holes and the strengths of both of them, and then reconcile them with his innate understanding of the real world.
The one thing I can say in favour of this war happening now is that we're going to see the impact of losing access to energy and access to fertiliser and all the critical elements that come out of the Strait of Hormuz, including.
Yeah, and I think he's good here to bring up the fact that this also impacts fertilizer, which also impacts food and food prices. And this is another essential commodity we all need to survive. And food prices have gone up, a crazy amount all over the world. And this is only going to exacerbate that problem, unfortunately. And I don't think it's something that's been talked about enough. So I do have to give him credit for bringing this point up.
It's turbocharging the really lackadaisical way in which the Western world has approached the issues of global warming. All these words are spoken about, let's get off fossil fuels, but really most countries aren't doing anything serious about it. This is now going to make so many countries think, holy hell, we can't rely upon that oil arriving anymore. We can at least rely upon the sun coming up in the morning and the wind blowing.
Yeah, and he's right, and that's my own personal view. The only problem is what he said before about the conflict of interest, right? There's a disincentive, arguably, for this happening from the perspective of those in charge, i.e., Donald Trump and his administration, who are personally gaining from the status quo, right? So they are the people that are in power to make this difference, to make this decision. But those very same people are disincentivized from making that decision because there's this opportunity to create generational wealth, to accumulate generational amounts of assets and never have to work again, and their ancestors never have to work again, right? And that's why it's important as citizens, we still have our rights to demonstrate, for example, which is being eroded away by the Labour government, unfortunately, and to vote, essentially, which again is being undermined by the Trump administration with respect to claims of voter fraud and wanting to take away voting administration from the states and bring it in-house, essentially, so that they can oversee it, which is obviously going to be a clear conflict with the right to vote, essentially. So again, that's what we also have to consider, unfortunately, here, despite this silver lining. Yes, it's more in the social consciousness, but unfortunately, we're relying on the ability to affect our governments, and unfortunately, that is being also undermined by governments in the US, in my opinion, and also governments we have in the UK, in my opinion.
So we all went through the COVID lockdown and we remember being unable to leave our homes because of the attempt to stop the spread of the disease, which was extremely badly handled. Just like virtually anything modern politics touch, they handle it badly. We're going to get the same thing out of this approach, because if we're going to have 20% less energy, then we're going to have a 20% fall in GDP, which is horrifying. But that'll mean we're going to have rationing. Energy is going to be rationed. Food maybe have to be rationed. And that'll make what happened during the COVID lockdown seem like a picnic, because at least during the COVID lockdown, you still got food, you still got energy. In this process, people are going to be being told, don't go to work from home as much as you can. But after all the pressure to get people back into the office again, now we're being told we have to work from home, not to stop a disease spreading, but to stop us running out of energy.
Yeah, and this might seem like hyperbole, but I don't think it is. I do agree with him, actually. And there was another I can't remember what this other video I was watching, actually, where it talked about the fact that the impact of this blockage at the Strait of Hormuz and this disruption is being delayed, but it is coming, essentially. And the reason is because the tankers that are carrying the oil, there's still a lot in transit because it just takes them so long to get to their destination. But eventually there will be no more tankers heading our way, and there'll be a gap of almost like a year or so before, once they start releasing the tankers again, to make it to our shores. And as a result, as I say, what's happening is that to offset this, countries are eating into their oil reserves, because again, they prepare for this kind of things if there are disruptions, and or they have to go to the market, essentially, and buy oil at spot price from presumably America. So again, another way of dealing with that is to just try and reduce the amount of energy and oil that is being consumed. And it's something that Gary Stevenson talked about actually in one of his more recent videos, where, you know, it's going to be the poorer people that are probably going to be asked or have to do this, whilst the very wealthy can carry on with their conspicuous consumption, so to speak. So again, it's a very valid point he's raising here, and I think it's something we can't rule out actually, that we could see a situation where food is rationed because of the lack of fertilizers, where energy is rationed, to make sure that, you know, critical services can continue, like the NHS, you know, the police, you know, government functions, etc. Until we get to a place where either we look longer term and move more towards renewable energy, or we open up the Strait of Hormuz, essentially.
And in that situation, if we don't stop ourselves running out of energy, then at a certain point, commerce comes to a complete and absolute halt, and we can't move anything. So the COVID lockdown will look like a picnic compared to what this will do to us.
Yeah, so a really instructive and valuable video, in my opinion, from Professor Steve Keen. As I say, definitely check out his channel. There's a lot more videos he has like this, which are really instructive. I am a subscriber of his, and if you feel so inclined, definitely leave a like, definitely leave a follow and subscribe, because as I say, it's important that you see the original content yourself and form your own opinion. I think from my perspective, he raises a number of really critical points. Where I have my own differences is how certain things are being framed. So in particular, the motivations of Trump and those around him, and how it could be framed as something that is opportunistic rather than strategic. Where I differ slightly in terms of what's been outlined here is that I believe there's just as strong an argument to think about what Donald Trump is doing as self-motivated rather than under coercion from Israel, and strategic, right? Because as I say, when you look at the moves he's made with respect to the tariffs, with respect to disrupting the Russian oil supply, with respect to capturing Venezuela's oil, and insulating himself from any attack that disrupts oil supplies coming from Iran, knowing it impacts all of those other countries such as China and Europe and Australia that competes with America, and at the same time being positioned to make perfectly timed trades. To me, it feels like there's a strong argument to argue that this is simply about creating an environment where Donald Trump can enrich himself, entrench his position in politics, and reward those that serve him and are loyal to him, right? And that is ultimately, in my mind, what potentially could be happening here. Because as I say, this idea that there's insider trading in scenarios like this, as unethical as it is somehow unique to the Donald Trump administration. I think, I'm not saying Professor Steve Keen is naive, but I would say it's a naive position to have. We just haven't just seen it as explicitly and overtly done in our faces, essentially. And I think for me, that is essentially what is going on in terms of the difference here. So yeah, I think really good video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, but hopefully you found that helpful. But until next time, peace.